right, welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be on the idea of the great American novel in relation to the topics we've been discussing: American identity, Huckleberry Finn, so on and so forth. It's actually going to be the last lecture I'm going to give on this mini introductory unit to American identity. From there, we're going to move on to Puritanism. If you want to see that all laid out in chronological order, highly recommend taking a look at the playlist that I have on my channel, which is the American Literature Survey course. So all of these lectures, even though they're coming out not in chronological order, they're arranged chronologically so that if you're interested in American literature, you're taking an American Literature Survey, you can start with this unit on American identity, move forward through Puritanism, American Enlightenment, Romanticism, so on and so forth, all the way up to postmodernism, and have a full lecture series, which, as I mentioned, I have really big ambitions for. I think this is going to be hundreds and hundreds of videos long. And I think things have been going pretty well so far. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about this idea of the great American novel, which is intimately tied up with the issues of American identity we've been discussing. You've probably heard the term before, great American novel, said usually in a sarcastic way. Maybe you've seen it in like some cartoon, television, film. Oh, he's writing the great American novel. And what is usually meant by that is he's writing a masterpiece. But this idea of great American novel is actually a historically constructed concept, and each of the terms in it holds a lot of significance. So starting off, we deal with novel, which when we get to the Enlightenment and when we get to Puritanism, you'll see this. For the first 200 years of American history, or at least American history prior to America, prior to 1776, we don't really have a novel. We don't have novels at all, actually. The novel is not a literary form that, for example, in the 17th century, it had been invented yet. Some people may make a different case. I think the novels have been in the invention of the 18th century. But in any case, we don't really have novels. We have poetry, we have sermons, we have all these other, drama, we have all these other literary forms, but we don't have novels yet. And so prior to the invention of the novel, which again is a historically constructed concept, it emerges in a particular time and place for a particular set of reasons that have a lot to do with culture, that have a lot to do with environment, that have a lot to do with history. But in any case, prior to the novel, if we want to come up with a literary form that is going to encapsulate the virtues, the vices, and the historic destiny of a given people, what sort of text are we going to be looking at? Well, if you studied literature before, you know we're looking at an epic. We're looking at epic poetry. This would be the Iliad, this would be the Odyssey, this would be the Aeneid, this would be Chanson de Roland in France, this would be El Cantar de Mio Cid in Spain. We have all these different, or for example, in England, you can make the case that it's Beowulf or it's Milton's Paradise Lost. But in any case, you have all these different texts, and they're essentially very long narrative poems that meet a certain series of genre conventions. There's a journey to the underworld. You have a hero who represents distinct national characteristics of that given people. There's a wise old man figure. There are all these different conventions of an epic. And this is not a lecture on epic, but it's to say that if you had the highest poetic or literary ambitions, because by the way, prior to the 18th century, poetry and literature were the same thing. There was no such thing as literature that was not poetry. If you were writing literature, people thought you were writing poetry. But in any case, if you had the highest literary aspirations for your people, say you're Virgil, the poem you want to write is not going to be an ode, it's not going to be an elegy, it's not going to be any of the other accepted genres of poetic construction. It's going to be an epic. And you're going to tell the story of the founding of a given people in most cases, and you're going to highlight the virtues and vices of your people within that given text. Now, America is a constructed nation. It's constructed in 1776 out of whole cloth. You have the American Revolution, which is really the American Civil War, or at least the first American Civil War, in the sense that it's a civil war between two sides of people that essentially are the same and just have different political desires. There are no Americans yet. Everybody's British. And so when the American nation is founded, and we'll talk a lot about this in Romanticism, there's this idea that, wow, okay, we're really young, we're really new, we're really different. We need works of art that explain why we're different from England. And I touched on this in the previous lectures on American identity, because a key anxiety for American authors and American intellectuals is differentiating ourselves from the European context, and in particular from the English context. Because if you think about it, in 1780, America is mostly Scottish, English, right? People of the British Isles primarily, so there's a sort of unified phenotype. People primarily speak English. People share a lot of ideas and in common cultural history that English people have. And so there's this need to differentiate ourselves. Well, if we can't differentiate ourselves on the basis of phenotype, or right, like race or ethnicity, if we can't differentiate ourselves on the basis of language, well, then we have to come up with some sort of idea that's going to differentiate us. And this is what we talked about in the previous lectures with the difference between ethnos and demos. France, Hungary, China, those are ethnoi. Whereas in the United States, what we have is a demos. We have a civilization that's based on a set of ideals, on propositional nationhood, on a common political project. Now, as a result of that, you have a group of American writers who try to produce the American epic that's going to differentiate us from England. This is a key concern. And the big author who's going to be doing that, of course, is Longfellow. Longfellow writes a long epic poem called The Song of Hiawatha, which very interestingly features a Native American character who goes through all these different epic trials and later becomes, quote unquote, civilized, adopts Christianity, adopts a certain Western mentality, but while still holding aspects of the sort of wildness of the New World as it's perceived by the 19th century writers. I get that a lot of that, gets into sort of problematic territory, but this is the self-conception that they have. And so Song of Hiawatha, in verse, right, because of course it's verse, it's a narrative poem, tries to become the American epic. However, there becomes a sense, particularly after the Civil War, that any novel that is any literary work that's going to fully encompass America cannot be an epic. That epic is a European form, and that what we're going to see in America is going to be distinct, just as everything in America is distinct. Instead of having monarchies, we're going to have a republic. Instead of a society that's based on unified language and ethnos, we're going to have a society that's based on this common political project. All the European values are going to be flipped on their head. So what we see in the American context is, well, if all the European nations in the period of Romanticism in the 19th century are trying to recover their national epics, what if instead of writing an epic, we wrote a novel, okay? And this term, Great American Novel, it's invented. It's actually written by an author by the name of John William DeForest, who's not a very well-known author. I mean, if you study at like the graduate level, you will read his famous novel, Miss Ravenel's Conversion from Secession to Loyalty. It's well known among people who study realism, study the late 19th century. But outside of that, his work is not really of literary merit. It's mostly of historical merit, and he's not very well read today. But he's the guy who comes up with this idea of the Great American Novel. And he actually gives a suggestion for what he says the Great American Novel is. He says, this is in a review of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harry Beecher Stowe. He writes that Uncle Tom's Cabin is actually the Great American Novel, and he comes up with that term. And the reason why he says this is because in Uncle Tom's Cabin, everyone is there. So all of America is present in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Well, what does he mean by that? You have enslaved blacks, you have free blacks, you have Quakers, you have New England Puritans, you have men from the Deep South, you have men from the sort of middle countries like Virginia, so on and so forth. You've got the backcountry woodsmen in Kentucky. Like, you have all these different groups of people that are, in some sense, are fully representative of all the different regional, ethnic, social varieties of American. You have high class, you have low class, you have black, you have white, you have Native Americans. Like, everyone is present in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so the idea for John William DeForest is this is a polyvocal novel that speaks all the American voices. We go from north, right? We start in Kentucky, and then we go south, ending, in the Deep South of Simon Legree, and we have the journey back again, and we have this sort of whole encapsulation or this complete encompassing of the American experience in one particular text. And there's an idea that the novel is uniquely positioned to do this, to give voice to all the sort of polysemous American voices that we have. And that term gets picked up and gets used for a lot of novels later. Like, for example, talking about Huckleberry Finn, the quote-unquote summer reading for this class, Huckleberry Finn is often said to be the great American novel. You have other contenders. You have Moby Dick, because Moby Dick, again, not only is it great in the sense of it's very aesthetically moving, it's a very beautiful, well-constructed novel. Moby Dick is one of the greatest works of literature ever written. I could probably do hundreds of lectures on Moby Dick. It's one of my favorite novels of all time. But Moby Dick is great in the aesthetic sense. It's American because it uniquely encapsulates the American experience and is a novel that could only be written by an American. But it's also a novel that contains all of America. The Pequod becomes a microcosm for America itself, led by Captain Ahab. And on the Pequod, everyone is there. Where you have all these different sort of misfits and immigrants and this, that, the other, together, working together on a common project in the Pequod. And the Pequod becomes a microcosm of the United States precisely because there's no ethnic or linguistic or religious unity that makes up the Pequod. They're not all Muslims. They're not all Scotsmen. They're not all speakers of French. There's no unity on the Pequod other than the fact that everyone is there because they want one thing, other than Ahab. Everyone other than Ahab wants one thing, which is money. Actually, I should say other than Ahab and Ishmael. Other than Ahab and Ishmael, everyone on the Pequod wants one thing, which is money. And like, how much more American can you get, right? We're all here. We all had families that came here because of self-made man, rags to riches, American dream. We all, whatever, our ancestors came here because they wanted to make money. They wanted to have social mobility. They wanted to have a quote-unquote better life. And so for that reason, we could say Moby Dick, contender for Great American Novel. You'll have other contenders that come later as well. But the idea is Great American Novel is great. It's aesthetically moving. It's a classic of world literature. It's American. It can only be produced by an American, and it operates in a uniquely American register or American voice, and it's going to encompass the whole American experience. Now, interesting note on John William DeForest, because this is actually going to relate a little bit to what we talk about with Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn. We're not going to get too much into realism and naturalism, though I do want to give you a little bit of an idea of what's going on so you can understand some of the historical context behind the claim that Huckleberry Finn being the great American novel, what was going on. Obviously, as I mentioned, we're going to go way more in depth with that in the lectures on Huckleberry Finn when we get to realism. But for now, you should know John William DeForest is operating the same literary tradition, the same, what do you want to say, episteme as Mark Twain, which is this period of realism that emerges after the Civil War, the American Civil War, if you like the Second American Civil War. But really like the big Civil War that happens in 1861 between the North and the South. And what John William DeForest is doing, he's obviously defending the Union position. You can see that in the title, Mrs. Ravenel's Conversion from Secession to Loyalty. Well, what is she going to do? She's going to essentially move from the Southern frame of mind, the Southern idea of what America is, to the Unionist idea of what America is. Because this is really what you see prior to the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s in America, is that you have two competing Americas warring for dominance. You have the Southern vision of America, which is much more romantic, which is much more hierarchical, which is like way less egalitarian, which is more based in European forms, more based in classical forms, and is very anti-liberal. And by contrast, you have the Northern version of America, which is less agrarian. It's much more focused on manufacturing and development, much more focused on immigration, much more focused on economics. Money is Puritan rather than high church. That's one of the differences North and South. Most of the Anglicans and Catholics in the South. In the North, you have most of the low churches. Much more focused on liberalism, rights. Like, you have all these different cultural differences that manifest themselves in ways that are still interesting to this day. Like, one thing I bring up to my students all the time is, if you go to a bar in the South, this may be less true now that, all the hipsters live in North Carolina, but whatever. If I go to a bar in Alabama, the Deep South, one of the first questions that people ask you is, where are you from? Not just because you're a foreigner, though that may be obvious by your accent or this, that, the other, but there's a sense in the South that people are defined by their families, by their religions, and by the places where they're born. That those are uniquely defining aspects of the individual. Whereas in the North, broadly speaking, which really is the rest of the country that's not the South, like, in a certain sense, Los Angeles contains aspects of the North, even though, whatever, it's as South as Mobile. But in any case, like, if you go to a bar in Detroit, Cleveland, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, like, take your pick. The first question people generally ask you is either, what do you do for a living, or where did you study? So the idea there is that your education and your work history are the key aspects of your identity. That I'm going to know more about you if I know that you're a lawyer and you went to Yale than I am if you told me you were born in, I don't know, Jacksonville, Florida. This is the idea. Okay, and those are unique North-South differences. Well, North and South are warring for dominance both in political economic sphere, but also in a cultural sphere in the period prior to the American Civil War. It obviously erupts in an incredibly bloody conflict. And the Northern vision of America wins out. The vision of America that's based primarily on economics, this idea of the self-made man, liberalism, immigration, capital, so on and so forth. And so to that end, the Southern vision dies out. And what we see in the period from 1865 really through the 1890s is a reaction against the Southern vision, which primarily is associated with Romanticism. And so both John William DeForest and Mark Twain, as realist writers, are going to go out of their way to show, no, the new vision of America that has emerged from the Civil War has nothing to do with Romanticism. Now, why do I bring this up? It actually starts to explain some of the weird decisions, or at least as most of my students find them weird, the weird decisions that Mark Twain is making in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So, for example, small things like the shipwreck that they encounter in the Mississippi, where the robbers are hiding, is named the Sir Walter Scott. Well, why is it called the Sir Walter Scott? Well, if you don't know, Sir Walter Scott wrote romantic adventure novels at the end of the 18th century and becomes very famous for this and is known widely as being one of the great romantic writers. Well, the idea is that Southern Romanticism, the inspiration for the South, that has sunk. That ship has sunk. It is no longer part of the American identity. Similarly, you see this between the difference between Huck and Jim, who are thoroughgoing pragmatists, and Tom Sawyer, who's a romanticist, right? Like that last section where they're trying to free Jim from slavery even though he's already been freed, and Tom comes up with all these ridiculous plans based on adventure novels and based on his, sort of Operation Romanticism that are totally impractical, that get him shot, that cause all these different problems. What is Twain satirizing there? He's satirizing the Southern Romantic tradition as being impractical, as being not at all viable in any sense, politically, economically, socially. And he's basically saying this is an outmoded vision of America, and that Huck, as a sort of microcosmic representation of the good American, is someone who is thoroughly pragmatic. He's on the move constantly, like the river. He's always seeking new frontier. He's always seeking to maximize his liberty. But the big difference between Huck and Tom is that Huck is down to earth. He sees what's right in front of him, and he's practical. He doesn't care about tradition, as we talked about in the earlier lecture. He puts no stock in dead people. He doesn't care about book learning. He cares about, how can I get things done? And that, to Mark Twain, is emblematic of what the new America in the post-Civil War period is going to represent. And this shows up in a million other places in the novel, too. One of the recurring themes of Huckleberry Finn is the criticism of the old vision of America. So, for example, or at least we don't want to say the old vision of America, the Southern vision of America. What you see in the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons in their sort of conflict and fight is that it's totally irrational. It's based on these sort of antiquated medieval ideals of honor, and they sort of see themselves as feudal lords. There's something like sort of Romeo and Juliet or chivalric romance capacity for what's going on in those particular set of chapters. But it's totally ridiculous. And Huck, who's totally down to earth, sees things as they are, sees his double, his doppelganger, his foil, Buck, who's the same age as him, Buck's 14, I believe, get killed as a result of Buck's essentially failure to adapt to the new schema of American society, at least in the sort of allegoric conception of this. And so Buck's death represents, in some sense, the death of the South. Going back to the point, though, it's represented, when we talk about Huckleberry Finn as being the great American novel, if you want to make that claim, I wouldn't, but that's one of the things that we talk about with Huckleberry Finn. We say it's representative of this particular American tradition that has had its ascendancy since 1865, and which represents, again, a sort of a series of polysemous American voices, which is represented by the fact that Mark Twain is using dialect. We have dialects, you have all the jokes about the dialects in the beginning, but it's true. It's we have the African-American vernacular that we see in Jim. We have the way that, Huck and Tom are going to talk. We have the speech of the men from Arkansas. We have all these different types of voices. We have high culture. We have low culture. We have the different span of races and ethnic backgrounds. And so to that extent, when people claim that Huckleberry Finn is the great American novel, they're going back to John William DeForest's claim that it has to represent all of America. And lo and behold, we go from north to south the same way that in Uncle Tom's Cabin we go from north to south and sort of cover the American territory. And on top of that, it also ends, as we mentioned, the same way it begins, with the going out to the territory, that there's something distinct about this idea that this linear geographic progression is not enough, that there has to always be the seeking of a frontier. Good. Okay, so moving forward, we talked a little bit about this idea of realism. Realism is the literary movement roughly from 1865. We could say 1861. I mean, once the Civil War begins, like you can already see this in, for example, Walt Whitman's poetry, which becomes less transcendental. We get Drum Taps, which is a series of Civil War poetry, and it becomes much more focused on like everyday practical reality. And the main idea behind realism is this idea of verisimilitude. Rather than romanticizing things, rather than talking about chivalry, about tradition, about honor, about all these sort of lofty abstract ideals, rather than talking about things that are totally like not pragmatic and could never happen, right? Like Tom's example of, escaping by using your tears to soften the bars of your jail so that you can, take a needle and like move through, like all these sort of impractical things. We're going to throw all that away and instead just focus on representing life as it actually is. And one of the things I talk about to my students is that realism is the realism of the camera, which is an invention during the period of the Civil War, right? We have like all the Civil War photography. The idea is let's just depict things as they are and get rid of any sort of transcendental, any sort of, ideological, any sort of abstract philosophical significance, abandon allegory, abandon, this sort of high prose speech, and try to represent people as they are by using the vernacular, by describing American settings as one would find them. And lo and behold, like Huckleberry Finn is improbable. Like the events of Huckleberry Finn, you would not say like, yeah, this is likely to happen. But there's nothing in Huckleberry Finn that happens that's impossible. And this is very different from, say, like if we look at the novels of Fenimore Cooper, for example. Like if you look at The Prairie, Last of the Mohicans, whatever, there are constantly things happening in those novels that could never happen in real life. And in fact, Mark Twain actually writes a super hilarious piece of literary criticism about Fenimore Cooper called The Literary Offenses of James Fenimore Cooper. Highly recommend reading it. It's laugh out loud funny, but where he basically points out, he's like, I was a boat operator. I have traveled over the country. I know for a fact that the things that James Fenimore Cooper is talking about in his novels, they could never actually happen. They are too romantic. They are too exaggerated. So when we talk about realism, we're talking about the realism of the camera. And as mentioned, this takes its ascendancy in the period after, starting with the Civil War and then leaving after the Civil War. And it's a reaction against Southern Romanticism, but it's also a reaction to, again, a couple of other things. The invention of the camera, a perceived idea that Romanticism, even in the Northern context, like Transcendentalism, was insufficient to explain the sort of cold, harsh realities of the Civil War, but also a sort of, an attempt to set aside ideological differences and to heal wounds. Like, hey, realism is just going to depict things as they are because we don't want to deal with any political themes or anything too controversial, anything too hot to handle ideologically. We're just going to depict people as they are. On top of this, you also have the growth of the class of people who can read, primarily like middle-class bourgeois women, who, as a result of the success of the Industrial Revolution, increasing number of immigrants doing the sort of hard labor, they have more free time to read. They have more free time to read, and you have the train lines connecting the country. You read on the train. You read in your leisure time, and as a result of that, one of the big topics of curiosity for these people, as America becomes more connected, as the West begins to be dominated and settled, is what is life like in other parts of America? And this is where we get this idea of local color, which is one of the subgenres of realism. Now, Mark Twain is not really a local color author, but he's using some of the aspects of local color, which is one of the sub-movements in realism, which is there are these novels and short stories where the plot becomes secondary, and the primary goal is just to describe a place such that you feel like you know what it's like to live in that place. Now, Huckleberry Finn has aspects of this, but like the goal of Huckleberry Finn is ultimately to tell Huck's story. And it has like a clear plot and it's moving things forward. Do we get somebody like, oh, here are the customs of people in Arkansas? Yes. But most local color novels, if you read them, their primary goal is just to give a sketch of what life is like in a particular place. And in fact, they have a lot of relations to that early 19th century genre of the sketch. And you can see here, no politics, no ideology. Let's just describe what it's like to live in, for example, Louisiana. Kate Chopin's non-feminist works, right? She has plenty of short stories that are just like, let me describe to you what it's like to live in Arcady, right? Let me describe to you what it's like to, for example, New England local color, a woman's tradition, because the authors are primarily women and the readership's primarily women. Let's describe what it looks like to live in a hamlet in New England and give as much detail. No romanticism, no high plot, no intrigue, no impossible events, just describing things as they are. As you can see, Mark Twain is drawing a lot on this in Huckleberry Finn. Good. Moving forward, and we'll talk, again, a lot more about all of these terms. I'm kind of brushing them over now just to give you a little bit of the context of what Huckleberry Finn is doing. Because if I were just to say, like, some people consider Huckleberry Finn to be the great American novel, and I don't define great American novel. I don't talk about how that's a historically constructed term. I don't talk about how it emerges in the period of realism. I don't talk about how it emerges in the post-Civil War period. You would have this tendency, which I hate, to just view Huckleberry Finn as like a trans-historical piece of great literature that has been handed down from on high. And I don't believe in that, which is why we're kind of playing with some of these concepts early on. I do believe Huckleberry Finn has interesting things to say about the American identity, and that it's deeply reflective of the ideology of a given period, but also, broadly speaking, of the cultural and intellectual evolution of America. But that's why I want to give these categories early on, because if I don't, like me telling you that Huckleberry Finn is a great book, that it's a classic of world literature, I think, one, is disingenuous because it doesn't talk about like where books come from, why books are appealing in a given moment. But two, I also think it's limited because we're not actually going to learn anything about America by saying Huckleberry Finn is a great book. I think that's a massive oversimplification, which is why I'm trying to avoid that in the way we approach these particular lectures. Good. Okay, moving forward. What is Huckleberry Finn reacting against? Well, we talked about this. Romanticism, and in particular, a substrain within Romanticism called sentimentalism, which is this sort of excessive focus on emotion, on feeling, on the interior world. So the Romantic authors, you see this in like, whatever, Dumas, as a clear example, the Count of Monte Cristo, is like this intense passion for revenge. Any sort of intense passion is a good one. Or for example, in Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther. Young Werther is torn apart by love for a beautiful woman, and this drives him to the brink of insanity, desperation. Won't spoil the plot. You can go read it. It's like 90 pages. You could go read it right after this. But The Sorrows of Young Werther, classic example of German Romanticism, is like the exalted feelings are the goal. And the feelings don't need to have an objective correlative in reality. It's just like whatever evokes feelings within the reader, whatever is evoking feelings within the characters. This is sentimentalism. And we see this made fun of in Huckleberry Finn, I think most clearly with Emmeline Granger, well, Tom Sawyer, but also Emmeline Grangerford, who, you know, before she died, wrote all this really awful graveyard poetry about death. It's very maudlin, about all these like sad, grim, dark feelings. Alas, I shall hear thy sweet chirrup no more, alas, right? Like all this sort of super over-the-top 19th century romantic poetry that Twain is making fun of, and I think with good reason. That's what's being made fun of with sentimentalism. So we see realism as a reaction against the sentimentalism of the early 19th century. But part of what, and this is why I bring it up, is like in the South, that sentimentalism, like if you go read the novels of William Gilmore Simms is a clear example of this, who, by the way, is like totally forgotten. He's an amazing writer, but because he was pro-slavery, his work is never anthologized. No one cares about it anymore. Edgar Allan Poe actually said William Gilmore Simms is the greatest novelist America has ever had. So it's kind of weird that we don't read him anymore. But if you read William Gilmore Simms, it's like, oh my goodness, it's so over-the-top sentimental constantly. And why? Because he's a Southern writer, because he's operating in that tradition and where that sentimentalism is valued. What we have in the post-Civil War period is an understanding that America is actually, rather than sentimental, America is going to be pragmatic. And lo and behold, like to this day, Americans are considered a pragmatic, business-oriented, action-oriented people. We're not super emotional. We get down to business. We stay positive. We're plucky. Like, we have all the characteristics that Huckleberry Finn has. Because why? This is the whole point of the new historicism, what we're talking about. Is you have these two layers going on at the same time, which is Huckleberry Finn is constructing American identity. It becomes popular, people read it, people resonate with it, and it begins to construct the idea of, like, Americans are like Huck. But it's also vice versa, that Huckleberry Finn is a reflection of an American identity that is emerging after the Civil War. So the claim that I'm trying to make here, if it isn't, like, abundantly obvious, is that, like, if the South had won the Civil War, Huckleberry Finn would not be popular. But actually, even more than that, I would say, like, dealing within the episteme of, like, the hypothetical world in which the South wins the Civil War, Huckleberry Finn would not have been written. Like, Huckleberry Finn could only be conceived of in a world in which the North won the Civil War. Because why? A particular set of cultural values become dominant, and the literature, almost unconsciously, starts to reflect the dominant values. This is the claim that I'm trying to make. Good. Picaresque, you should understand, this is a genre that actually goes back to Spain, the picaro, right? A sort of classic rogue-like figure that you see very popular in Spanish literature, where you have this character who's usually broke, usually poor, but he gets by on his wits. He's clever, he can dupe people, he's good at lying, making disguises, he's kind of a hustler, he thinks on his feet, and they're humorous novels that essentially deal with satire, right? Social satire. We got Jonathan Swift, the great English master of satire, but what we have in the picaresque is, let's satirize all the different classes of people. So in a picaresque, everyone has to be present. High-class characters, low-class characters. Rich characters, poor characters. Men, women. Servants, masters. The clergy, laymen. Like, all the different social categories. There are different regional varieties. You're Andalusian, right? You're a guy from Madrid. Whatever. All the different geographical, social, religious, gender categories have to be present in the picaresque, and everybody gets made fun of, right? So through these sort of series of funny circumstances that the hero of the picaresque gets himself involved in, everybody gets made fun of. And what do we see in Huckleberry Finn? It's the same thing. Huckleberry Finn is everybody gets made fun of. Everyone is present, from the lowest of the low to the highest of the high, and Huckleberry Finn gets by primarily on his wits, through his ability to make disguises, tell good lies, think on his feet, so on and so forth. And we see the whole geographic span of America from north to south, and all these different characters, high class, low class, so on and so forth, all getting made fun of. So to that end, a good way of explaining what is going on in Huckleberry Finn is to talk about Huckleberry Finn as being a picaresque. Good. Satire. And I want to mention this. We're going to have a whole unit on naturalism where we deal with this. But Mark Twain is one of those authors where he straddles the line between the period of realism and the period of naturalism. And naturalism roughly takes off from, like, the 1880s, 1885, going up to really the period of the First World War. It kind of dies off at the turn of the century, but there's continuity right up to the period at the end of the beginning of the First World War. And the naturalist authors take all the realist presuppositions of verisimilitude, realism is the realism of the camera, use dialect and vernacular, reflect life as it is, but just try to make it even more scientific, so to speak. So Mark Twain, if you know anything about his literary trajectory, he starts out a realist, he ends up a naturalist. And the naturalist authors go actually a step further and say, instead of focusing on the local color of America, like all these different regional varieties, let's focus on life in the city. And let's try to understand the city as being a petri dish for the principles that we see guiding life. So you notice we're starting to get ideology back in the mix. Not that there's ever a position which, what do you want to say, is neutral to ideology. Like realism reflects, I would say, the ideology of liberalism. But the realist authors are really trying, at least in their own self-conception, not to be ideological. Well, in naturalism, we start to see a shift whereby they say, no, actually, even though we're ignoring religious and philosophical concerns, it seems to me that the truest form of social existence, the truest way of explaining how human beings interact with each other, was proposed by Darwin, who Darwin, if you don't know, very, very, like in the 19th century, extraordinarily popular in the English-speaking world. He's widely read in England. He's widely read in America. In fact, his biggest audience is in America. Outside of America, his theories are not well accepted at all until like the 1950s, legitimately. People don't realize that, but it's true. Darwinism really only takes off in the English-speaking world. In France, in Russia, in Germany, Darwin's theories are not well accepted. But the point is, in America, Darwinism and then the sort of extrapolation from Darwinism that we call social Darwinism really takes off because it becomes a way of justifying and also explaining what happens in the post-Civil War period, where massive immigration, country like massive industrialization, country starts to do very well economically, and you have the growth of these massive cities. And so the focus at the end of realism tends to move more towards financial accumulation and the justification of the system by essentially saying big fish eat little fish. And so the classic example of the naturalist novel is we're going to present life in the city, but we're going to present it without moral judgment. We're just going to say this is the way things are. We're going to look at these characters and not be emotionally invested in them and just try to treat them like they're bacteria in a petri dish. So Huckleberry Finn, you're emotionally invested in Huckleberry Finn's success, his character, so on and so forth. In naturalism, you're not really invested in the characters at all. Classic example of this is Stephen Crane's Maggie, a Girl of the Streets. Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, short novel, 80 pages. I'm going to spoil it for you, but you can go read it right after this. It'll take you 2 hours. Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, super interesting novel. It tells the story of Maggie, who's a rose in a mud puddle. I think that's the opening line. She's a rose in a mud puddle, and she falls in love with this guy. Things go south. He essentially whores her out for money. And long story short, last scene of the novel, she's on a dock, and a guy who looks like a jellyfish, right? So this big fat man comes up behind her and ostensibly, it's difficult to tell, but ostensibly rapes her and then stabs her and throws her body in Long Island Sound. And so you go, oh my goodness, what? And there's no redemption. There's no character change. There's no character arc. It's just big fish eat little fish. And quite literally, that the jellyfish man, is described as being like an animal. He's the biggest fish, and he dominates Maggie. And so the whole point is, beauty, virtue, all these other categories that were relevant in Romanticism, in Neoclassicism, become totally irrelevant in this new American context, which is driven primarily by social mobility, rags to riches, big fish eat little fish. You have to be better, faster, stronger, cheaper than your competitors. And life is an enormous competition where we're competing for scarce resources. That's the outgrowth of realism. Now, this is just looking a little bit ahead of Huckleberry Finn, but I bring this here so you can think about it. Huckleberry Finn, in its sort of genre, stylistic form, literary form, whatever you want to say about it, does reflect certain transhistorical aspects of the American experience. I think that's true. But the point that I've tried to get at in this lecture is a lot of what it reflects is actually very historically contingent. It doesn't come out of thin air. It doesn't come out of Mark Twain's genius. It's reflective of a set of concerns of a given time period. And within 20 years of Mark Twain writing The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, those concerns are going to be completely different. The aesthetic mode is now operating in something that's much more urban, that is much more ideological, that's much more focused on, as I said, social Darwinism, social conflict, class conflict, so on and so forth. And Mark Twain's vision of America slowly starts to become outmoded as that earlier seed of America that you see reflected in the realist worldview grows into something else. So realism is a necessary step along the way, but that plant is eventually going to grow. And when that plant grows, the next stage in that growth, that is a necessary outgrowth of the earlier stage, is going to look totally different, which is naturalism. And so you're going to see there's a conscious evolution of the American idea, that things are always a reaction to and a borrowing from, and that it's never one static, this represents a transhistorical category. It's always a constant evolution, and things always have origins. And part of our jobs as literary scholars is to try to trace the genealogy of where things come from. It's not enough just to say, this is the great American novel, what a wonderful work of literature this is. We want to figure out, yes, maybe it does have transhistorical things to say about America or about the human condition or whatever you want to say, but much of what it has to say is constructed. And so where does that come from? And how can we use that to trace the evolution and the growth of the American idea, of the American character, and help us understand our own period of time in which we live in, our own episteme, which I would say is postmodernism. Good. Muckraking, we don't need to get into that. Now, if you want to know what it is, just real quickly, it's another genre that becomes very popular in naturalism, which is journalism that exposes social abuses. So people living in tenement housing, corruption of corporations, so on and so forth. But it has to deal, again, with increasing industrialization of American society, urbanization, so on and so forth. But the point being, a set of concerns that are completely different than the concerns that the realist authors are dealing with. So everything is always in evolution. Now, there's a logical trace in how that evolution is going to take place, and that's the scholar's job to uncover what that is. But there is never going to be a static. There's always going to be an evolution. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this lecture and this sort of opening to the course, it's that. We're not here to trace a static Platonic idea of America. We're here to trace the evolution of an idea that, yes, does exist, but which evolves and changes over the course of history in response to certain changes in material condition. Good. If you have questions about that, please put comments down in the chat or down in the comment box. I know it may have been a little bit confusing, but hopefully you got something out of this, and it started to explain Huckleberry Finn and these ideas of American identity a little bit more for you all. If you are curious, I would also recommend, like, if you're enjoying these lectures, I have a 22-part lecture series that is in pre-sale. It's not fully developed yet, but it's in pre-sale. You can find it down in the description. That is my How to Be an Intellectual course called The Scholar's Path. It's basically, as I mentioned, 22-part lecture on all the different aspects of the intellectual life, from religion, from studying languages, because you can't be monolingual if you want to be an intellectual or artist, from how to approach film, how to approach music, how often to read, how often to write. Like, it's got all the information that you would want to know. It's a course that I developed almost for myself. It's like all the things that I wish I would have told myself when I was 15, I put into this course material for you guys, which I think is invaluable. I'm really proud of the stuff that's coming out of there. I actually just recorded the video on film, and I think it's very, very good. It's also got some exercises in there that I think are useful. You can go take a look at that down below. In any case, thanks for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you all around.